Hello, my name is Chuck Easley, and the title of this paper is Failure is an Option, Failure Barriers and New Firm Performance. This paper is joint work with Robert Eberhardt and Kathy Eisenhardt. This paper is part of a stream of work that I've been doing on institutions and entrepreneurship, and so this spans both formal and informal institutions. The motivation for this paper starts with a number of national efforts that have been done globally to try and increase new firm formation. So this includes the US, Germany, Canada, Britain, and Startup Chile as well, which I've been doing some research on with a doctoral student here. Yet we still have relatively little empirical evidence that such efforts lead to more entrepreneurship and particularly more high-performing new firms, such as the type of quick-growing firms that lead to more economic growth. And so I'm going to start with the observation that failure matters. The most common experience for someone who's going to start out as an entrepreneur is that they're going to wind up failing. And so the institutions that govern what happens in the event of a failure are going to be particularly important for entrepreneurship. We know from previous research that institutions are connected to firm formation, and that new firms tend to form that when there's been a change in the institutional environment such that they're better aligned with that institutional environment. But we also know that firm founding and failure are connected. And so failure in one sector can increase foundings in another sector, such as what happened with prohibition and soft drinks. And we also know that when firms fail and go bankrupt, a lot of their resources wind up getting recycled into new firms. So we know from prior research that lowering the barriers to entry or changing institutions can increase the rate of firm formation. We also know that different types of institutional change can shift the mix of who it is that starts firms. Some of my own work in China shows that when you lower entry barriers, you might get lower quality individuals becoming entrepreneurs, versus when you lower barriers to growth, you tend to get higher quality, higher human capital individuals becoming entrepreneurs. And we also know from previous work that changes in bankruptcy law have an effect on firm formation, particularly amongst higher wealth individuals. But there are still some open questions, particularly how do formal institutional changes influence firm performance? This is highly relevant for job creation and economic growth. And also, how are institutions that govern the failure and bankruptcy of firms related to new firm performance? This is particularly relevant for how government reforms actually work. So our research question is going to be, how do government reforms that influence bankruptcy influence both the formation and the performance of new ventures? Now, I should take a moment to note that there is a finance and economics literature on bankruptcy. And this literature tends to argue that the optimal bankruptcy policy is going to balance the ex post benefits to maintaining the continuation value of the firm versus the ex ante incentives for effort provision. And so this work has been done by a number of folks at Harvard, including Aghion and David Sharfstein. There's been a tendency to argue that more entrepreneur-friendly bankruptcy laws, less harsh bankruptcy laws, are going to wind up resulting in higher interest rates, and that this is going to result in fewer startups due to those higher interest rates. Yet, empirical evidence shows that actually across states in the US, those that had more entrepreneur-friendly bankruptcy laws actually result in more, not fewer startups. So we suspect there might be something else going on here. And see this research as part of an important trend in the literature to show that entry rates are not the whole story. And so a lot of Ramananda's work on churn and financial constraints fits into this category, as well as his work with Bill Kerr on banking deregulation, looking at how that influences the size at entry, and work with Tom Nicholas and Matthew Rhodes-Kropf on innovation outcomes. So our empirical setting is Japan, Japanese bankruptcy reform. So prior to this reform in 2003, Japanese bankruptcy law was quite harsh. And so, it was the time to go through the bankruptcy process was quite long. Personal assets weren't protected, and the founding CEO was required to be fired and replaced in the event of a bankruptcy. So all of this changed with the 2003 corporate reorganization law. So we're going to look at this in an intriguing context. Japan has high levels of technological innovation, but is known for having relatively low levels of entrepreneurial activity. And so this bankruptcy reform, for the first time, protected personal assets, allowed for a much faster bankruptcy process, and no longer required firing of the CEO. So you might already be asking, isn't Japan simply risk averse? Isn't there more of a cultural story that's going on here? So this has been noted going back to Hofstede in 1991, that Japan has a particularly high level of uncertainty avoidance or risk aversion. So we would expect that to the extent that culture is playing a role in this way, it should make it more difficult for us to find our effects. And if anything, we might be underestimating the impact of this type of bankruptcy reform. But it's interesting to note to what extent formal institutions might actually be shaping this informal cultural norm of risk aversion. But perhaps most importantly, the empirical results on risk aversion are actually fairly inconclusive, in that entrepreneurs tend to exhibit very conventional risk aversion profiles. And although the theoretical literature on entrepreneurship has often assumed greater risk tolerance amongst founders, the empirical literature actually shows that there are really no differences in risk attitudes between entrepreneurs and general business people or managers. And so there's actually been some work trying to resolve this apparent paradox by splitting apart demand uncertainty and ability uncertainty. But nonetheless, the overall takeaway is that these risk aversion attitudes are actually not that strongly related with the propensity towards entrepreneurship. And so if that's true, then we actually need to look for what other factors in the Japanese society and institutions might account for these levels of entrepreneurship. So this is a plot of the level of new company formation for each of 3 years in Japan. And so most of the previous studies of reforms over this time period in the 1990s in Japan tended to conclude that the reforms that were put in place didn't really work. But we suspect that that's partly due to these studies looking more at the overall rate of new company entry rather than looking at the performance of those firms, which actually might tell us a very different story. So our hypotheses. The first hypothesis is about the performance effects of this reform. So after the reform, do we actually get more quickly growing startups? And our hypothesis is that that is indeed the case, that we expect that lowering the barriers to failure and this bankruptcy reform will increase the performance of new firms. And so we think this will happen for a couple of reasons. One is that we expect that bankruptcy reform should entice more elite entrepreneurs, those who are higher in human or higher in social capital, to become entrepreneurs and start firms. And we know from previous literature that such individuals tend to start more highly performing firms. And the second reason is because we expect those entrepreneurs that do enter after bankruptcy reform will pursue higher risk, higher return types of opportunities and will manage more effectively in order to grow the firm rather than to manage or to pick opportunities that might avoid bankruptcy rather than those that lead to higher growth. So our second hypothesis is about the failure effects and the bankruptcy rate. And so unsurprisingly, we expect that after you make bankruptcy more entrepreneur-friendly and lower the barriers to failure, we should see an increased likelihood of bankruptcy. But we expect to see this effect as particularly strong for the elite entrepreneurs. And so this is because these elite entrepreneurs have more at risk. Their superior human and social capital allows them to accumulate more wealth, as well as to have better career opportunities. And so under the previous bankruptcy law, bankruptcy would be actually much more punitive for those who have more to lose. And so we expect that there'll be, especially for those elites who did actually start firms, once the barriers to bankruptcy are lowered, they'll be more likely to shut down firms that are underperforming in their eyes and pursue new, potentially much more attractive opportunities. And so that's our third hypothesis, the effects on founding rates. And so we expect that after the bankruptcy reform, we'll see an increase in the likelihood that elite individuals will start new firms. And so for those less elite individuals, we expect this to have less of an impact on them because they tend to be more likely to be pushed into entrepreneurship when they have fewer other career opportunities or job prospects. Elite entrepreneurs, on the other hand, tend to be more likely to be pulled into entrepreneurship by more attractive opportunities. And so we expect that the reduction in risk is going to disproportionately influence these elite entrepreneurs who, for entrepreneurship to be more attractive to them, they're going to be facing high risks not only in the good job opportunities that they would be leaving to become entrepreneurs, but also the wealth levels that they would be putting at risk, and the type of high growth, potentially high risk types of firms that would tend to, types of opportunities that would tend to pull them into entrepreneurship. So the data that we're going to use to look at this come from Japan. And actually Japan is quite similar to many advanced economies, including the US, similar to the US commercially in terms of corporate law, national wealth, imports and exports, government debt, foreign direct investment, and particularly similar to the US after an era of reform after the financial asset crisis in 1990. And so we're going to take a look first just at simple descriptive statistics. One of the things that I learned in graduate school is that if you can see the effects just in the simple descriptive statistics, then that's a pretty good sign that something interesting is going on there. And so you can see that we've divided the firms into pre-reform and post-reform time period. Those that were founded pre-reform and wound up going bankrupt, and those that were founded pre-reform and those that were founded post-reform. And you can see that the percentage of bankruptcies has increased post-reform, as we would expect, and that these are particularly the bankruptcies by firms founded by elite university alumni increased by about 20%. Second, in terms of the foundings, we see that those firms that were founded pre-reform and post-reform, we see a significant increase in the firms founded by elite alumni. And we also see this significant increase in the cumulative average growth rate of revenues, which is going to be a performance metric for those firms that were founded after the reform. So for our methods, we're going to take advantage of a particularly comprehensive data set in Japan and also use differences in differences estimation. So we're going to take advantage of this natural experiment of Japanese bankruptcy reform. We use the Tokoku databank, which consists of about 50,000 Japanese corporations. You can think of this as very similar to the Dun & Bradstreet database in the US. So this is a highly accurate database in that they actually go in and do in-person audits. We're going to include all industry groups, but we're going to exclude any subsidiaries or any non-operating companies. So we're going to use differences and differences, where our first difference is going to be pre and post reform, and our second difference is going to be across treated and untreated firms. Since this was a national level of reform, we're going to use the theory to pick a control group of firms that should be relatively less affected by bankruptcy reform than others. So we have two different control groups that we're going to test and wind up finding robust results. These are the consulting firms, which you would expect to be less impacted by bankruptcy because they typically would not have to go through bankruptcy proceedings. Someone could just declare a loss in that particular year for their consulting firm. And the primary industries, things like farms, coal mines, forest logging, these tend to be less risky, they tend to be passed from parents to their children. And so these are two groups of firms that should be less affected by the bankruptcy reform, but still affected by the general macroeconomic trends. And so, if the economy is doing better, you'd expect these types of firms to also be growing more quickly. If there's some kind of overall cultural change going on over time, then you would expect these types of firms to also experience that change. And so this allows us to better isolate the effects of the reform. So our differences and differences estimation is going to rely on an assumption of common trends between the control group and the treated group. And so here's a plot of those primary industries that I mentioned in blue, those from non-elite universities in green, and then the strongest effect coming from those from elite universities in red. And so we see what we would like to see here, which is fairly similar trends amongst all three of these groups before the reform, but the elite being much more affected by the reform, and our control group being relatively unaffected by the reform. And so these are the this is the increase in performance over time. So our variables, our dependent variables, are going to be performance, bankruptcy, and founding a new firm. Our key independent variables are elite entrepreneurs, which we're going to define as either attending a top 10 university or the CEO age at founding. And then obviously a post-reform founding binary variable. We're going to include controls for a number of initial conditions of the firm, as well as various time-varying conditions. So we're going to control for their initial capital, the industry, as well as over time, the changing macroeconomic environment, as we're going to use a panel regression. So we have interaction effects and nonlinear models, and so we're going to show some graphical representations. But actually, when you're using differences and differences estimation, the interaction coefficients are actually the effect that you're looking to estimate, and so this is less of a concern in differences and differences models. So here's a simple scatter plot. And you can see in the years post-reform, you get a lot more variance in the growth rates. And this variance is particularly coming from those who were elite entrepreneurs. And so this is consistent with our overall performance predictions. And perhaps a more fair way to look at it, if you look at just 4-year growth rates for firms founded in 2002 before the reform, and 2004 just after the reform, as we would expect, you see significantly higher growth rates for those founded after the reform, particularly at the 75th and 95th percentile. And so this was the graph that really started to convince me that something interesting was going on here around the time of the bankruptcy reform. And these growth rates, these higher growth rates at post-reform, are not just isolated in a particular sector, particular industry. These are pretty broad-based across sectors. So to more systematically test these, we're going to run some regressions. So this is our first hypothesis, where we expect that the firms that are founded after bankruptcy reform should be significantly more highly performing. And so I'm going to first look at our differences and differences estimates and look at the growth rates relative to consulting firms and relative to before the reform. And so we're going to find that the consulting firms after the reform are performing significantly worse, but yet the firms that are, and we're going to find that overall the post-reform firms that were founded after the bankruptcy reform are growing significantly faster, yet this is not true for our control group. And that this effect is particularly strong amongst the younger firms. So as we might expect, it's those young firms that were founded after the reform that are growing particularly faster. And these effects, as we suspected, are particularly strong amongst the elite university alumni. So overall, the elites tend to found faster growing startups, and this effect got stronger after the reform, or the elite founded firms after the reform are particularly high performing. And so this is evidence that not only are more elites becoming entrepreneurs, but they're actually managing more effectively and going after more attractive opportunities because they're not trying to simply avoid a bankruptcy and managing more conservatively. And so these are the variance confidence intervals, the variance in our performance measure, compound annual growth in revenues before the reform and after the reform. And we see that the variance is significantly higher after the reform. So this is evidence that they're going after perhaps a higher risk, higher reward type of opportunity. And so looking at our second hypothesis for the likelihood of bankruptcy, we see that the likelihood of bankruptcy goes up after the reform, and that these effects are especially strong for the elite entrepreneurs. They're particularly likely to file for bankruptcy after the reform. And so this is true whether we look at elites by age or whether we look at elites by those that attended top 10 university. And so the regression results are consistent with these descriptive statistics, where the reform is resulting in an increase in the likelihood of bankruptcy, and that these effects are especially strong for those elite entrepreneurs. And so our next hypothesis is that there's not only more foundings more bankruptcies by elites, but there's also more foundings. So you see significant increase in the elite entrepreneurs founding firms, elite individuals founding firms after the reform. So we're also going to look at this in a piecewise hazard rate model. And so here you see that the elites are significantly more likely to found a firm after the reform. And so these results are robust to a number of robustness checks and alternative explanations. So you might suspect that this is due to some kind of larger trend in macroeconomic shifts, but this would tend to affect all levels of society. It's hard to imagine a story where this particularly affects the elites. In addition, we control for macroeconomic and monotonic trends by including time trend control. There were other reforms going on in China, but these mainly focused on the banking system and governance in large corporations. And so these reforms would be unlikely to affect an individual entrepreneur's decision to either start or to terminate their firms. So just to show one robustness check, I showed you the results for the consulting firms as the control group before. These are similar results where instead of consulting firms as the control group, we substitute those primary industries as the control group, and we get similar results. There are a few limitations of this study, as with any. First of all, with the national level reform, it's really difficult to have a true control group. So here we're using the theory to help inform us about who should be more strongly affected and less strongly affected by the reform. We find results consistent with that. Obviously, one big challenge for the entire literature that's still unresolved is how to parse the cumulative effects of multiple reforms. It'd be nice to have more accurate and more precise measures of elites. And it's also difficult to obviously estimate the larger social welfare implications. There are clearly trade-offs happening here between creditors and entrepreneurs, but also with employees. Well, we tend to think that employees would like to work for a higher growth firm. There may actually be some benefit to having more stability in employment and less churn going on. So a summary of our findings after bankruptcy reform that lowered the barriers to failure. We first of all have more high-performing firms being founded, especially those by elite entrepreneurs. Second, we have elite entrepreneurs becoming more likely to both declare bankruptcy and to start a new firm. So we have greater churn going on amongst this pool of the best and the brightest, which is actually helping the performance of startup firms overall. Theoretical contributions, this idea of barrier to failure, in contrast to much of the previous work, which has tended to focus on barriers to entry being the relevant margin at which the institutional environment affects entrepreneurship. We've pushed the literature into looking more at the implications of institutional reforms for firm performance rather than just entry or survival. And we also want to emphasize here, and also with a subsequent paper that we're working on IPO reform, that what happens at the end of a life's firm can have important effects that influence the incentives of individuals to found firms and what types of firms they found. So key policy insight is that bankruptcy law is a particularly powerful lever to promote entrepreneurship, and particularly more high-growth forms of entrepreneurship. Lowering entry barriers may increase the overall rate of entrepreneurship, but lowering barriers to failure may be a particularly effective way to attract the best and the brightest to start firms, and it's motivating these types of individuals to become entrepreneurs that tends to get you a bigger bang for the buck in terms of economic growth through entrepreneurship. So overall, if you remember one thing from the talk, lowering entry barriers may help you to determine whether you can start a firm, but lowering failure barriers determines whether you want to start one. And through this mechanism and attracting more elites into entrepreneurship, it influences firm performance. So again, this is part of a broader stream of work that I've been doing in Japan, in China, as well as in Chile, looking at institutions and entrepreneurship. Some ranges from more formal institutions to we've done a lot of work in China on Project 985 and various other reforms and institutions in China, to more industry level context, shaping the types of strategies that are more effective in entrepreneurship, to more informal institutions and looking at social movement organizations and also at science parks, to see how these types of factors in the informal institutions can shape firm strategy and entrepreneurial performance. So thank you very much.